Well, howdy, everybody, and welcome back to the farm. Welcome back to our series, Why Stanley Kubrick? Today, we have Volume 5, and once again, we're going to be talking about
The Shining.
And only The Shining, because, as I said in the last episode, I do think that in the long run, this is going to be Kubrick's most memorable and influential movie on future generations. I think that the impact of 2001 was absorbed by other genres and films, like Star Wars, which actually adapted some of the techniques that Kubrick used in 2001. One major difference is that Lucas's team, Industrial Light and Magic, used a blue screen and an optical printer to sort of stamp two film images together. And that was a painstaking process, but it allowed for a lot more camera freedom and the ability to use fill lights to make the models look prettier. If you watch 2001, the models look very starkly lit and a little bit flat because of the lack of fill. But in Kubrick's defense, that's what space looks like. And he was trying to transport the audience into the real world of space travel. But today, we're going to be talking about a much more down-to-earth film, in a way, although now we've opened the floodgates to the supernatural, something that Kubrick has not done before. There are no supernatural elements in Dr. Strangelove. There are no supernatural elements in 2001. There are no supernatural elements in A Clockwork Orange or Barry Lyndon. They are sort of relentlessly materialistic in their point of view. And in the last episode, I tried to provide some explanation, or at least some context, for why Kubrick chose a horror novel that, as even he himself expressed it, sort of teetered on that borderline between the psychological and the supernatural. In our next volume in this series, we're going to talk about all the theories about the Overlook Hotel. What did the hotel want? Who are all these ghosts? And so, in order to get at the heart of these mysteries and talk about some of the interesting tidbits of information about how the movie was actually filmed, in order to figure out the Overlook Hotel, we're going to have to check into the Overthink Hotel. And much like the Overlook Hotel, in the Overthink Hotel, you're never quite sure exactly what's going on. You're never sure exactly what's going on because you're busy considering every option and being paranoid about every clue. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. And it probably won't be scary. Just like some people say The Shining is not actually scary. Kind of like the movie itself, I'm just gonna overload you with information. At least mine will be fairly well organized. But again, no real suspense or fear. In fact, I can say confidently, in this episode, you will not hear anything that's extremely interesting or useful in any way, or even funny. There will be plenty of attempts at comedy, but kind of like The Shining itself, I'm a little unsold on whether or not the humor will actually land. And so, as the pre-production on The Shining started to wind down, and it came time to actually set foot on the set, the pressure was on. Kubrick had worked with some big names before, Kirk Douglas, Peter Sellers, George C. Scott, and some up-and-coming shining stars like Ryan O'Neal. Now, I'm pretty sure most of you can't put a face to those names. I'm sure they sound familiar, and that's because these guys are relics from the old studio. And so Kubrick definitely had tons of experience with those sort of actors. In particular, he was used to working with a lot of actors that had theater training. And so they had this sort of raw, real-world ability to capture the blocking and the physicality and nail all the lines with their highly trained memories. If you've ever worked with or been around someone who is a serious Shakespearean actor, you'll get blown away by how they can rattle off these lines. They basically internalize an entire 4-hour play. And so being a great stage actor, especially in the traditional way that they trained actors in Britain, was kind of a feat of intellectual prowess and emotional bravery. And the problem is that the new crop of actors that showed up in the very late 60s up through the 70s, actors like Al Pacino, John Cazale, or Cazale, Robert De Niro, Dustin Hoffman. And what set these guys apart was the naturalism. These are guys that didn't do the big cinematic acting of the past. And, as we'll talk about, in the 70s, new film stocks and a new type of color processing made the image on the screen look more like real life, a little less painterly, colors that are a little raw and faded like real life. So Kubrick is jumping headfirst into this new world. And as we'll see, he's still bringing a lot of his old studio habits with him. And in terms of performances, his expectations are similar to the old studio system and the kind of overacting that you often saw in movies in the 1960s. Now, we know a lot about the production of this movie because Kubrick had become very famous and notable, and his daughter Vivian had grown up, and the role that she took on the set of The Shining was to film behind-the-scenes footage of the filming of the movie for posterity. Now, as I said in the last episode, this documentary footage did not have the result that maybe she was hoping for. It sort of painted her father as a kind of mean-spirited curmudgeon who was hypercritical of everyone's work, and forced everyone to go along with some very strange choices about the writing and the acting and the set design. And we see Kubrick being rude to his daughter, even. There's a moment where Vivian is trying to film something. Kubrick needs to walk past her. He needs her to, make a hole, as they say in the Navy. And so he just yells, "Out of the way, Viv." I think Kubrick was on edge and easily frustrated because a lot of money was on the line. This production had taken up pretty much all of Elstree Studios. And as I said, Elstree is located on a giant lot, acres and acres and acres, in a suburb outside of London. And Kubrick was not only becoming frustrated with his actors, he was becoming even more frustrated with these British film crews who were very slow and very expensive to work with. The labor and union laws were extremely tough, very strict, especially in 1979. Even George Lucas refused to work in Britain again after his experience shooting parts of The Empire Strikes Back at Elstree. So a lot of Vivian's behind the scenes is not Kubrick berating actors, but just sort of quietly grumbling and pushing the British crew, complaining about their afternoon tea break, which they would always insist on. And of course, that's right when Kubrick's getting going. And the beauty of a soundstage is that you don't have to worry about the sun. So Kubrick could take his time and get everything right. And as we'll talk about, even the majestic, intense sunlight that we see in some of the interior shots, especially in that big lobby of the Overlook Hotel, where Jack Torrance supposedly does a lot of his writing. We'll talk about the lighting setup required to produce that effect, but it was not the sun. Now, one thing I want to mention is that as we talk about the film, we're going to be leaking out spoilers here and there, but I don't think that spoilers are really a big issue for this movie. Number one, I think most of you have seen it, or you're very familiar with it. And then, for the people who haven't seen it, I can tell you that it unfolds pretty much just like you'd expect. There are no M. Night Shyamalan style twists or turns. There is no moment where you're like, holy shit, I didn't see that coming. It's more like, oh yeah, that's creepy. Just like I expected. Watching The Shining is more like having an experience rather than watching a story. And I think that's the fundamental difference in Kubrick's approach as compared to other directors or even writers. Most directors spend all their time in their own heads, figuring out how to put what's in their imagination on the screen. Kubrick did that, of course, but he also spent, I think, almost equal amounts of time in the audience's head, trying to get inside their head and envision them watching all the endless variants of his internal movie and trying to discern how the audience will experience it, trying to predict how they will feel. He's trying to play our emotions like a piano. He's not trying to give us information or, like I said, captivate us with a rich and fascinating story. In fact, he once mentioned that the reader has a huge advantage over the author of a work of fiction. He says because the reader has the exclusive opportunity to experience the story as it unfolds in real time. But the author always sees the story from God's point of view. The author can't experience his story without knowing how it ends. He can't start from the beginning and have the story come at him unexpectedly. That's an experience that only the reader can have. And Kubrick thought that that advantage was actually important. I mean, as we'll see, he almost, I think, took that a little too seriously, because he would sort of assert things as a reader that contradicted the author. So, that's a little weird. Maybe arrogant? I don't know. And so, let's start with the opening credits. This movie has some interesting stuff to talk about from the very first frame. In the very first scene of the movie, we're kind of smacked in the face with Kubrick's first strange choice. And of course, I'm talking about the typeface, or the font of the opening credits. The Shining establishes itself as an unusual horror film that stays away from dark shots, through most of the film, and most of the film is shot in bright light or sunlight. Kubrick wanted that departure from what had become typical for horror movies. And over this bright, sunlit scene, a helicopter shot of the Rocky Mountains. And over this bright green and brown background are the credits, and the opening credits, to describe it in the most uncharitable way, that paints an accurate picture in your mind, even though it may not be entirely accurate. It's basically in a baby blue Comic Sans font. And that's strange. And we get more stern classical music at the very beginning, but this time it's run through some sort of synthesizer. It's sort of a creepy electronic kind of classical music, but it's still very similar to the musical tone of the opening of Barry Lyndon and A Clockwork Orange. So he's sort of sticking to the formula there, although, as we'll see, this movie has far less music than his previous films. Now, more about this helicopter footage. The quality and the smoothness of the footage was pretty novel at the time. We're so used to these kinds of shots now because we have digital image stabilization and 4K cameras mounted onto drones. This shot had to be done with an old-fashioned helicopter and a guy leaning out of it with a 35mm film camera. This is, I think, the first example in the film of the use of the Steadicam harness. Think of the Steadicam harness as basically a kind of mechanical image stabilization. It's this frame that's strapped on to the camera operator. It holds the camera for him, and he just guides it with his hands, and it provides a very smooth picture while you're walking or driving. Now, of course, we're used to that now. It's nothing special at all, but it was back then. Audiences in 1980 had not seen that kind of very smooth, soaring footage. And Kubrick's going to use this a lot in The Shining to provide the point of view of the Overlook Hotel itself, or the various ghosts that inhabit it. And this footage was so well done and so difficult and expensive to shoot that it was actually used twice in 2 different movies. Some of this footage was repurposed for the extended ending of Blade Runner, which was created in 1982. So even 2 years later, other filmmakers remembered that footage. Now, there is a fairly explicit screw you to Stephen King in the very first shot. The novel opens with the Torrances driving to the Overlook Hotel in their bright red Volkswagen Beetle, or more properly, Volkswagen. Well, Kubrick's movie opens on a helicopter shot of a bright yellow Volkswagen Beetle driving through these winding, narrow roads in the Rockies. And then, much later in the film, we see a shot of the aftermath of a car accident, where first responders are crowded around a red Volkswagen Beetle that had been crushed under a truck, presumably killing the driver. Now, here's my theory. I don't think that this was intended to be primarily a middle finger to Stephen King. I think that this is the first example of Stanley Kubrick making choices that don't make sense on the surface, but if you dig into some of the more technical considerations, especially when it comes to photographing this stuff, I think Kubrick had some logic behind his choices. So, why did he go from red to yellow? Well, I think he thought that the red color just wouldn't stand out enough from the background. It was very small in the frame, so it needed to jump out to the viewer. A medium shot at road level of a red Volkswagen Beetle would be just fine. The audience wouldn't miss it. But this moving helicopter shot from way up in the air, the audience might take a while to see the little car, and that would be a problem. And so every photographer knows doing headshots or photographing some object to sell it or for a catalog or something like that. If it's a dark object, you put it in front of a bright background. And if it's a bright object, you put it in front of a dark background. And so if you're doing headshots, you really need to know what color hair your subject has. So I think Kubrick's choice of yellow was strictly a technical choice. And as we'll see, this is the first of many changes that were just a result of switching from the medium of words and the imagination to a medium that was just a series of moving 2D images that had to be photographed somehow without CGI and with a budget that was pretty much all used up on the set itself. So now let's... Oh, hold on a second.
Hey, babe, how's it going?
Fine.
Did you get a lot recorded today?
Yes.
Hey, weather radar says the storm's gonna hit around 10 tonight.
What do you want me to do about it?
Come on, babe, don't be so grumpy.
I'm not being grumpy. I just want to finish the episode.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later with a beer for you and a frosty glass. Then maybe you could let me listen to some of what you've done.
Katie, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and you interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And then it will take me time to get back to where I was. You got it?
Yeah.
Fine. Now, we're going to make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, and you hear me talking, or whether you don't hear me talking, or whatever the fuck you hear me doing in here, then when I'm in here, that means I'm working. That means you don't come in. You understand?
I understand.
Fine, and you can go ahead and bring me that beer now. Never mind later.
Okay.
Cut, stop, just stop it. What in God's name was that supposed to be? I don't see any angst, any energy. And you need to keep your head tilted more this way. Stop trying to look at her.
Okay, got it.
Cheat out because I need to see your eyes. And your eyes need to be wider. Tilt your head down more. Keep looking up. Head down. Eyes up. Head farther down. Try to look at your brain. And, Katie, I'm not getting any fear from you. You need to hesitate to look him in the eye. Think of a big, growling dog. A big, bald, growling dog.
Oh, okay, sure, I can do that.
Places everyone. Rolling. And action.
Hey, babe, how's it going?
Fine.
Did you get a lot recorded today?
Yes, I did.
Hey, weather radar says the storm's gonna hit around 10 tonight.
What do you want me to do about it?
Come on, babe. Don't be so grumpy.
I'm not being grumpy. I just want to finish the episode.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later with a beer for you in a frosty glass. Then you could let me listen to some of what you've done?
Katie, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and you interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. You got it?
Yeah.
Fine. Now we're going to make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here and you hear me talking, or whether you don't hear me talking, or whatever the fuck you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means I'm working. That means you don't come in. Understand?
I understand.
Fine. And you can go ahead and bring that beer right now. Never mind later.
Okay.
Cut, stop, just stop it. This is painful. Where's the hatred? I can hear you yelling at her. We've got enough volume, but volume doesn't equal hate. You don't have to be loud to be hateful. I don't want to hear the hate so much as feel it radiating from you in your body language.
Okay. More like a seething rage, a simmering.
Can we get more powder for Vincent's head? That glare is killing me here.
Again? I think I can feel it caking up on my head.
Don't tell me how to do my job. You're the one who didn't want the hairpiece, and I'm not going to stop the camera down just to eliminate that glare.
Well, you've got the key light right there, so maybe I should turn this way.
You seem to think you're some kind of photographer. And that may be, but you're definitely not an actor. Understand?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the reflection off the wall here would...
Now, do you want to do any acting today, Vincent, or would you rather be my assistant DP?
That'd be cool. I could help out with the cameras, sure.
I don't need your help. And, Katie, we got to talk about your approach. I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish here. I mean, are you on heroin? Why so stilted? I mean, do we need mood music in here or something?
I'm sorry. I mean, I'm kind of doing my best. You don't have to be a jerk.
Are you seriously reading your lines from your phone? How can you internalize the action when your brain is trying to remember what you're supposed to say? The lines should flow naturally after being internalized.
Look, you just emailed me these lines 20 minutes ago. I don't have that kind of time or memory, especially not for this.
Well, if you don't want to be here, Katie, you can go home. And we can get a professional to do the work that is required.
Whatever. Let's just get this done. I don't really care.
Outstanding. Great work ethic. Just try to look like you're a living human and not made of wax. Now, places, rolling, and action.
Hey, babe. How's it going?
Fine.
Did you get a lot recorded today?
Yes.
Hey, weather radar says the storm's gonna hit around 10 tonight.
What do you want me to do about it?
Come on, babe. Don't be so grumpy.
I'm not being grumpy. I just want to finish the episode.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later with the beer for you in a frosty glass. Then maybe you could let me listen to some of what you've done?
Katie, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me, and then it will take me time to get back to where I was. You got it?
Yeah.
Fine. Now we're gonna make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, and you hear me talking, or whether you don't hear me talking, or whatever the fuck you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means I'm working. That means you don't come in. Understand?
I understand.
Fine. And you can go ahead and bring that beer now. Never mind later.
Okay.
Cut, stop, just Stop it. I still don't feel the hate. I mean, get into the headspace of the character. And to do that, you have to think of Katie as Wendy. She's not helping you do that due to her inability to emote. But you have to set that aside and say, you know what? I'm going to do some quality work here, even if no one else wants to. So you need to equate Katie with Wendy. Jack hates Wendy, so you hate Katie. Katie is holding you back. Katie has been nothing but a stumbling block in the way of your dreams of becoming a podcaster. And now she interrupts your recording with pointless chit-chat and promises to bring you a beer? You're trying to work. I need to see that desperation. Think of what a poor job Katie is doing with her lines, and internalize that disappointment, and convert it to rage for your character. Honestly, Vincent, right now, I'm angrier at Katie in real life than you seem to be in the scene right now. And you're supposed to be chasing her with an axe in 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'm out. I can't do this anymore.
Where are you going? This is the only scene on the sheet today.
Maybe we should try this again tomorrow.
Tomorrow? Oh, come on, Vincent. Seriously? We're killing ourselves out here trying to get this scene in the can, and you're talking about tomorrow? You two really are the worst actors I've ever worked with.
Yeah, well, we'll have to live with that.
Nice attitude. Good luck, you two. You're gonna need it.
Wow. Okay, well, sorry about that, guys. I thought we'd do something cute and funny. Somebody, not naming any names, somebody had to come in and make things complicated and take all the fun out of it and kind of wear us down until we agreed to do this outlandish kind of acting. Now, another thing to say about this 1980 movie is that it has a very modern look. This wasn't because Kubrick had just switched away from Technicolor. It looks like Kubrick had always hated Technicolor. Now, Technicolor is this sort of extended lower tech process for developing color film. It creates that sort of bright, artificial look that you see in movies like Cleopatra or Lawrence of Arabia or Singin' in the Rain or The Sound of Music. By the early 1970s, with the advent of the new counterculture, more realistic filmmakers, to get more of that realistic look, they all stopped using Technicolor and started using 35mm film that offered a much more direct color developing process that makes the colors look more natural. It makes it look like you're photographing real life instead of whatever they were doing with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner in The Ten Commandments. That's a Technicolor movie. Now, some directors were still using Technicolor late in the 1970s. In fact, this guy named George Lucas filmed one of his obscure, little-known flops called Star Wars in 1977 in Technicolor. And even in 1986, the great Akira Kurosawa shot his masterpiece, Ran, using Technicolor. And it's a very violent movie. It's made in Japan, about feudal Japan, so how could it not be incredibly violent? And so there's a lot of blood in the movie, and it's kind of strange because the blood looks like bright red paint. It doesn't look like real blood. And that's partly an artifact of the Technicolor process. Kubrick didn't just use the 35mm film that he had used for Barry Lyndon and for A Clockwork Orange. He was using a state-of-the-art film stock that captured very, very rich colors, rich, realistic colors. And Kubrick used this to great effect. That modern, sharp richness is part of, I think, why the movie has staying power. Because it looks like it could have been released in 1990, not 1980. But of course, the one thing that betrays its 1980 origin are the ridiculous, cringy late 70s hairstyles and a style of decor that screams late 70s because, oh boy, do they love their oranges and ochres and browns and pea soup green. Okay, so enough about the film itself. So what's Kubrick gonna put on this film? Well, if you've seen the movie, you know that the biggest character in the film, really, is the hotel itself. It's the set. And Kubrick did an insane amount of overthinking about the set and how to create an environment that feels unsettling, confusing, timeless, claustrophobic, haunted. So, how did he do that? What was his approach to building his version of the Overlook Hotel? And were there any key differences between Kubrick's Overlook and King's Overlook? Well, the first difference is that the hotels are pretty different. Stanley didn't shoot at the Stanley. So Stanley Kubrick did not choose the actual Stanley Hotel that Stephen King and his wife had stayed in for the setting of his film. Stephen King really likes this hotel, apparently, the real Stanley Hotel, outside of Boulder, Colorado. In fact, he liked the hotel so much that in the 1997 miniseries of The Shining, a much more faithful adaptation of Stephen King's novel, and it actually was shot at the actual Stanley Hotel. But they ran into problems, and they ran into the problems that Kubrick had sort of anticipated, because the Stanley Hotel is still a fully functioning, open hotel trying to do business. And so the production company for this 1997 miniseries had to pay the hotel owners fairly exorbitantly to use parts of the hotel and keep actual guests out of the way of the filming. Now, the topiaries, the elaborate landscaping that the Overlook Hotel has in the novel, was created using CGI in 1997. And, as we all remember, the CGI in 1997 wasn't awesome. So the CGI topiaries didn't quite have the effect that they were looking for, I think. So Kubrick knew that they couldn't shoot at a real hotel. Not only was cost an issue and efficiency, but Kubrick wanted complete control over every aspect of the design of the Overlook. And Kubrick wanted that control because he had plans. He had all sorts of psychological tricks to hide in the set. Now, the Overlook Hotel that we see in the film was based on an actual hotel in Yosemite, and it was used for some of the exterior shots. Some of them. The exterior shots that involve a lot of snow were shot on sound stages, with some considerable expense of reproducing the facade of the hotel on a soundstage on the other side of the Atlantic. So, the exterior and the general decor vibe of the hotel was based on this real hotel in Yosemite. But Kubrick went wild with the interiors of the hotel. One thing that Kubrick was already considering was that Stephen King had created this setting of the creepy Overlook Hotel that was haunted and demonic and wanted to hurt people by manipulating them into doing terrible things. And so Kubrick wanted the hotel to feel wrong from the very beginning, but not in an obvious way. He didn't want to make the hotel some sort of creepy, dark, Gothic cathedral with lots of big wooden heavy doors and echoey stone corridors. Of course, that would make the audience think, whoa, what's going on with this hotel? But Kubrick wanted something much more subtle. He wanted the hotel to look beautiful and admirable in broad daylight, with big, inviting open spaces, but then somehow at the same time feel off. The way he achieved that was to design each soundstage as kind of its own separate world, and they represented different parts of the interior of the Overlook Hotel. But if you tried to fit them together in some sort of map of the Overlook, it wouldn't work. You have halls that make these sharp U-turns around corners that don't leave room for actual guest rooms, even though there are doors to rooms on one side. But these rooms would have to be only about 5 feet by 5 feet in terms of their floor space in order to fit into the space shown in the film. And a lot of this strangeness of the hotel layout is underlined through Danny's tricycle rides through the hotel. And we'll talk about how they captured that, because it was a new technique. And so the hotel interior is a kind of maze, just like the hedge maze outside the hotel. There's a linking there. In fact, later we'll talk about the soundtrack, and we'll show how Danny's winding tricycle rides through the interior of the hotel mirror him running for his life through the hedge maze later on in the film. And so if you watch the movie, the first big indication that something is wrong with the hotel, it's really hard to notice the first time you watch, if you're not looking for it, is the job interview. When Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson, shows up at the Overlook Hotel to talk to the hotel manager, Mr. Ullman, about possibly taking on the job of being the caretaker of the hotel through the long winter. When the hotel has to shut down because the weather is so bad, the hotel pretty much gets snowed in for half the year. And whoever is watching over the hotel during that time is kind of trapped there. And at the job interview, Mr. Ullman informs Jack Torrance of some of the shady history of the hotel and a story about how one caretaker of the hotel had murdered his family during their winter stay at the hotel. Now, at the beginning of the job interview scene, if you follow Jack Torrance from the lobby of the hotel where he was waiting to Mr. Ullman's office, if you think about the hotel layout while you're following them walking, you'll notice that they turn a corner into a room that has an exterior window that opens out onto the chilly fall sunlight of the Rockies. But if you were to draw a map of the hotel layout based on what you see in the film, you'll notice that that window shouldn't be there. It should actually open to an interior hallway. And so I guess Kubrick was thinking, well, the audience won't notice it consciously, but their brain's going to notice. And if you keep throwing things at the audience, over time, their brain is going to start to register that time and space don't matter as much inside this hotel as they do in the regular world. And probably the most famous piece of decor of the Overlook Hotel is the carpet on the upstairs hallway. It's a very peculiar, striking pattern. Once you see it, you'll know what I'm talking about. But it's a geometric pattern that involves, of course, a lot of orange. And Kubrick had this carpet laid down in sections and not glued down so that the carpet could be picked up and moved. And the reason he wanted to do that is because in some shots, the carpet pattern is reversed. So the carpet pattern changes throughout the movie. And that's one more bit of weirdness that Kubrick added. And we'll talk about later that Kubrick actually would create continuity errors on purpose. So a lot of people will notice chairs that disappear and then come back in the background between shots, or books that have moved, or even locks on a door that are suddenly missing. And Kubrick did this on purpose. And we know that because of the documentary. And we see Kubrick moving things between shots. So it wasn't an accident. And these things build up over time, like I said, and become more and more extreme until, of course, people are seeing full-blown parties from the 1920s playing out in the Gold Room, and Wendy is seeing rooms full of skeletons when she's trying to get out of the hotel. Okay, so we have created a hotel that's supposed to be way up in the Rocky Mountains that has been created outside London. How do you light this? Regular photography lights cannot imitate sunlight. They don't look like sunlight. Now you can make them look more like sunlight. You can fake it, but at great cost and elevated risk. So let's talk about the lighting. Unfortunately, we'll have to get into some of the technical aspects of lighting, but I promise I'll make it as quick as possible. And there's a story at the end that involves the lighting setup that Kubrick used. So this is an FAFO story on Kubrick's part, because he went nuts with the lighting to get the fake sunlight he wanted. But in the end, it cost him. Now, to better understand the challenge that Kubrick faced when trying to create artificial sunlight in 1979, we'll have to dive deep into what sunlight is and how it's produced. Unfortunately, this is going to take a while, and it's going to involve some math, well, really geometry, and some quantum physics. But it's important for understanding The Shining. So, pretty much the rest of this episode, and we've got about 2 hours left on this episode, and we'll be talking about sunlight, the sun, how it produces light, and how this massive stream of photons from the sun interacts with the Earth to create what we call sunlight. Just kidding. Just kidding. We're not going to talk about quantum physics, because that's not important. What's important is the human brain and how it perceives images and how cameras work. Because really what you're trying to do is trick the human brain. Because you can't actually create sunlight on Earth without setting off a thermonuclear device. So, I boiled it down to just 3 things. 3 things that you need to know about sunlight that are important for photography. 3 things that you gotta achieve in order to fake sunlight. What do you have to do to make the audience's brain put up a little flag that says, hey, that's sunlight? Well, the first thing to know is that sunlight is crazy bright. It's a lot brighter than we even think. A beam of unfiltered, unfettered sunlight will destroy the sensor on a digital camera. And when you're shooting outside with film or a digital camera, you're going to have a very small aperture, or the sky will be white, and there'll be glare on everything. As I mentioned in a previous episode, sometimes you got to go all the way up to 22 to get a good image, if you're on a beach in the Caribbean, as I said. In fact, f-stop 16 is sometimes referred to as sunny 16, because if you're shooting outside on a bright day, you know your light meter's probably going to tell you f16 based on the other settings you want. So, sunlight is very bright. And so number 2 is, the next thing you need to know about sunlight is that it has a very specific color range. And the human eye and the human brain actually evolved to detect this color range. And so we know that sunlight can go from a kind of rusty red to a bright baby blue, but each step in that gradient is a particular color. They're mostly types of white. And the different tones of white in photography are referred to as the color temperature, and it's measured in Kelvin. And even though Kelvin is a measure of temperature, notice that we don't say degrees Kelvin, it's just Kelvin. Okay, so sunlight at noon on a clear day is about 5,500 Kelvin. And when I did photography, my little xenon tube strobes could imitate that bright bluish whiteness at that specific brightness for less than a millisecond. 200 microseconds, to be exact. Now, the third thing is the trickiest one to explain, and so I saved it for last. Here's the thing. Sunlight is parallel. These photons, these beams of light coming from the sun, although they spray out from the sun in every direction, the Earth is so small compared to the sun that all of the light beams that strike the Earth are almost exactly parallel. It's such a small angle that the human eye can't detect it, and so sunlight is basically parallel. Now, think of the difference between the straight, parallel beams of sunlight shining through a window compared to a little incandescent light bulb that's turned on, or compact fluorescent. No matter what type of bulb you use, that bulb is gonna, just like the sun, spray light out in every direction. But the bulb is not nearly big enough and not nearly far enough away to have parallel beams. And your eye can see that right away. Because if someone is standing under a light bulb, you've got light beams going directly from the bulb to the far walls, to the floor, and they're all hitting at different angles. And your eye can see that right away. Where, as we all know, sunlight comes in these sort of straight sheets or columns. And so to imitate the sun, Kubrick had to achieve those 3 things. The first thing he needed was a big light source, as big as possible, a bank of lights taller than the actual set, meaning lights that go all the way up to the top of the soundstage. Then he needed that bank of lights to be extremely bright, unreasonably bright. And now let's talk about how much electricity you would need to achieve that level of brightness. Now the first thing we need to do is define a watt, W-A-T-T. A watt is 1 joule per second. A joule is just a measure of pure energy. So when you hear E equals mc squared, that E stands for energy. And if you were to actually sit down and try to do the math on, well, how much energy would be produced if I converted my body mass into pure energy, you'd get an enormous number for E. Now, E is measured in joules. Let me spell that because it sounds like Jewels. But it's based on an old scientist's name, and so his name was Joule, Joule. And so let's set some baselines. my strobes, my little xenon tube strobes, that could imitate sunlight for 200 microseconds, when they were charging up, when they were getting ready to flash the xenon tube, they would draw 400 watts for just a few seconds. If I had all three running at full power, I hardly ever used the full 400 watts because that's crazy bright. But if I had all three of my strobes running, they would pull a total of 1,200 watts for a few seconds. And that is quite a bit. But then, if you think about, say, a big deep freezer that someone's got in their garage, that's going to draw maybe 800 watts, and not for 200 microseconds. It's going to draw that 800 watts anytime the compressor is running. So the lighting setup on the soundstage where they shot the big lobby of the hotel, the scenes where Jack is typing away on his typewriter or throwing that tennis ball against the wall, and you've got those tall windows with that cold light coming through. Well, that was artificial. And to run that bank of lights continuously required not 800 watts, but 700,000 watts. So, in order to imitate that cold Colorado sunlight pouring through the windows, he had a bank of lights outside those windows that drew 700,000 watts. That's enough electricity to power a skyscraper like the Burj Khalifa or a luxury hotel like the Waldorf Astoria. But instead of that electricity going through fluorescent tubes and air conditioners and televisions inside of the hotel rooms, all of this insane amount of power is flowing through some very, very large and increasingly very, very hot light bulbs. And so you might be thinking, well, use a series of fans or some water cooling system. Surely when you're spending millions of dollars, you can find a solution to this kind of problem. Well, now, I've never read this, but I would suspect that Kubrick would not want the fans because that would cause noise, and it looks like Kubrick always hated looping, or what they call ADR, additional dialogue recording, and that's when you can't really hear an actor very clear on the set. And a lot of times for outdoor shots or shots on an airplane or next to a waterfall, you're not going to be able to use the sound from the set. Kubrick liked to use as much real sound from the set as possible, including the sound of Danny's tricycle tires. And in the documentary, you can see Jack Nicholson pulling microphones and batteries out of his costume that had been taped to him like he was some sort of undercover police officer trying to gather evidence against the mafia. So, I think that may have been one reason why fans were out of the question. Some sort of water cooling system would have been impractical because of the final thing. Remember that third pesky thing about the light beams being parallel? Well, I went through all that trouble to explain that because that was the final nail in the coffin. Because these bulbs, even though they are large and the bank of lights is very tall, and they are very bright, but the beams are not parallel. These bulbs are kind of, shaped like mushrooms, and so they're going to spray light out in a broad, say, 90-degree arc, but we got to cut that way down. So what do? I'm sure a lot of you have seen these honeycomb things that photographers will put over their lights. And they're just sort of black grids. Sometimes they're hexagonally shaped, but most of the time they're just cross-hatched. And you put this black thing over the front of the light, or the soft box that you're using. And what it does is, primarily, it makes the light way less bright, because that black fabric is designed to absorb light. Now, what a very deep honeycomb will do is it will only let light through that's more or less parallel. Any light beam that deviates, that wants to go in some other direction, is going to strike the black fabric of the honeycomb and be absorbed. And unfortunately, thanks to the laws of physics, when that light is absorbed by the black fabric gets hotter. Now, based on the information I could find about this incident that I'm about to talk about, they were not able to determine the exact cause. But we do know that at some point, this bank of lights set the set on fire. And they were able to save the soundstage, but they were forced to spend millions of dollars that were not in the original budget. And they had to rebuild that set and make sure it matched the original one. So I have 3 possible theories as to exactly how this fire started. One might be even the smallest short in the circuit inside any of those lights could have caused a major sparking incident. Maybe just the extreme heat ignited something that was touching one of the lights. You know, in the 90s, you had a lot of problems with halogen lights doing that. Another possibility is that the honeycomb caught fire because it got so hot. They usually make those out of a kind of stiffened fabric anyway. Now, the third theory is a little more extreme, but I want everyone to recall that when Stanley Kubrick was shooting Barry Lyndon, he committed to shoot the film with no artificial light. And so he went to enormous extremes to get the shots that he needed without any artificial light. So now that Kubrick is relying 100% on artificial light, my theory is that when Kubrick made the choice to spurn artificial light, he angered the god of movie lighting, Lux, Lux, who was the Roman deity of movie lighting. So the kind of lighting that you use on a movie set. Lux was in charge of that. And film directors used to offer sacrifices to Lux before starting production on a film. Now, when Kubrick didn't use any artificial light at all, he severely offended the god, and like a jilted lover, Lux struck back and caused this fire that destroyed the set. That's my third theory, and I think it's the most likely. I think that an offended deity is more plausible than 700,000 watts of electricity catching some black fabric on fire or causing a spark due to a short. Those are kind of wild, out of left field theories. Okay. I talked a long time about stuff that I wasn't really planning to talk a lot about. They were in the script. These were bullets that I had written down. I didn't think they'd take a whole episode. But you know what? I am going to blame Stanley Kubrick. Because that little sketch toward the beginning was not supposed to be as long, and I thought I would have time to talk about some other things, in particular, Kubrick's treatment of actors, especially Shelley Duvall. So I suppose we will start with that in the next episode, which, at this point, I'm starting to think may not be the last episode on The Shining, because we got to talk about Kubrick versus the actors. We got to talk about those scenes that took so many takes, and talk about maybe why they took so many takes. One scene took 120 takes to get in the can the way Kubrick wanted it. Then, of course, we'll talk theories. I promise we'll get there in the next episode. We'll talk about what really happened in this movie. Was it all in their heads? There is a quote-unquote no ghosts in The Shining theory, where nothing supernatural actually happens. I'm going to show why I think that's not a very solid theory, based on information we have from Kubrick himself. We'll talk about who unlocked the storeroom. Is Danny really telepathic? what was going on in room 237. What was going on in that room that Wendy looked into, and there was the dude in the bear suit? Yes, if you haven't seen the movie, there's a famous quick shot of a hotel door being open, and you can look through the crack in the door and see on a bed a man in a tuxedo and a man dressed in a bear suit, seeming to have some sort of intimate connection, or I guess to use Jada Pinkett Smith's term, they were having some sort of entanglement. So we'll talk about what those shots mean. What does the ending mean? What's the deal with that photo at the end? And of course, after we're done with The Shining, we're going to talk about, I would say, probably my personal favorite Stanley Kubrick movie, just in terms of watchability. If you told me, hey, Vincent, you got to watch a Stanley Kubrick movie tonight, I would probably pick Full Metal Jacket. It has a more contemporary pacing. It's got some very deep, disturbing themes. So we will probably spend an unreasonable amount of time talking about Full Metal Jacket. But we still got to get through The Shining. So in the next volume, we'll explore this film further. And hopefully I'm not boring anyone too much. I promise less physics in the next one. There won't be any discussion about sunlight or what a joule is. We'll just stick to this mean old guy yelling at people on a set in England and try to figure out what was he trying to do and were his methods effective and why did he want the result that he wanted. And so, until next time, talk to you later.